Hi there, welcome to the archives. So today I want to revisit African history. So we're going to do Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen, and this one is written by Linda M. Heywood. I also watched yesterday the Netflix docudrama of Njinga. So Netflix has the African Queen series, and it's produced and narrated by Jada Pinkett Smith, and it features dramatized fictional reenactments as well as interviews with experts. So I watched Njinga, who's a queen of Ndongo and Matamba. So that's what this book is about. This episode, we're going to talk about the kingdom of Ndongo. So the video I posted before this was a kingdom of Congo. This one is a kingdom of Ndongo. And so at the time of the Portuguese arrival in Congo, Ndongo was the second largest state in Central Africa. And it says here that the word Angola comes from in the kingdom of Ndongo, because that's what they call their leader, their ruler, right? So like the king, basically, of Ndongo is called ngola. So that's what Angola is named after, or what it means. So it says, unlike Congo, Ndongo had a few rivers that kind of was like just treacherous falls, there's whirlpools. The main waterway led to the center of the kingdom, and you can get there through small boats for about 125 miles. But then at some point, the Cambambe waterfall, which was 70 feet high, it made it impossible to navigate. Okay, and so the Lucala River is other main water course in the kingdom, basically was a tribute to the Kwanza. And you can also navigate some parts. There was spectacular waterfalls. It prevented a lot of people from actually using it. Okay, so lots of waterfalls. Part of the Kwanza flows. There's swamps that contain crocodiles, hippopotamuses, other dangers. Portuguese arrived to this area mainly around 1575. And the local people are called the Mbundu. The Mbundu people, which is who Njinga rules over. And the people adopted the climate, which went from semi-arid to coastal. There were cool, frosty areas as well, too, in the plateau regions. Other parts were humid and tropical. Right, so again, Africa is really, really diverse in climate. Everybody just think it's tropical, which for the most part it is because we're closer to the equator. But there are places in Africa that have cold weather where it snows. In South Africa, for instance, even in the North Africa, there's some areas where it's cooler. Okay, and so here we have Luanda right now is the modern day capital of Angola. It also existed at this time. Low-lying coastal areas south of Luanda, including Kisama, was semi-arid and just basically inhospitable, right? Not a whole lot of life. The baobab tree is really popular as well, too, as a lifeline for the local population. It provided them a lot of food, shelter, medicine as well, too, and water. And so in terms of like for the geography nerds, there's large slabs of rocks, salt. They mined and distributed all over the country. So the rock salts were really popular and also became a port of export for the region as well, too. Cattle, goats, pigs, fawn, fowl, all of these were domestic animals. And the kingdom was divided into 17 provinces, including 736 territorial divisions. Okay? Some of the provinces, especially the four between the coast and the capital at Kabasa, they had higher populations. So Kabasa was the capital at the time, where some of the first Portuguese delegations went. They visited the capital in 1560, right? So 1560 is when the Portuguese made its way over there. At the time, some of the rulers were said to have more than 70 children. Some of the rulers had as much as 400 wives and concubines, right? Imagine having 400 wives and concubines. Now we like, oh, 4 wives, 400. And again, that's very similar to other parts, right? When we've done the 50 when we've done the 50 warriors, you've seen in places like Japan, where they had the royal courts, they had 400,000 of concubines as well too. Same with Vietnam, same with China, right? The royal courts, a lot of the rulers had concubines. Same with Europe, right? In Europe as well too, they were known to have concubines and multiple wives. And so Africa was no different. Sometimes when we think of Africa, we think of it as like so primitive and so different and cut off or removed from the rest of the world. But our rulers also had concubines, and like a lot of them, right? So the chief wife, she ran the household, and she ensured that all of the slaves, the serfs, and free people living within the walls of the court carried the goods that they produced. They bought supplies, all of the household. So again, we saw this. Was it Ubuntu that worked in the court? You saw this in China, right? There's a hierarchy even within the courtesans, even within the wives. Remember, there's like the first wives, the third wives, so there's different levels. It sounds like there was something similar happening in Africa, in the kingdom of Ndongo. Okay, the Ngola, remember the Ngola is the ruler. He exercised a great deal of military, political, and fiscal authority over the different regions. And women that were connected to the Ngola household, so like the royal household, including his mothers, his wives, and his children, it says they typically did not participate in battle, although Njinga is a little bit, and her sisters were different. But for the most part, they would have a general to protect their secret location. It wasn't really always known where they lived. They had local priests that performed rituals. The local priests were called, what were they called? Let me see here, I have it written down. Ngangas. The local priests were called ngangas. They were essential to the spiritual life of the Ngola. They provided advice to him, and you see that in the Netflix documentary, right? The king pretty much doesn't do anything without going, or even in Njinga, when she was a woman king, they don't do much without consulting the local priests, okay? And so they perform rituals, place skulls and other sacred items on landscapes to intimidate the enemies. And their core duty was to the royal ancestors, right? So again, they would consult the ancestors doing, I can't think of the word right now, divinations, bones, they would check, right? So all of that was used to kind of get messages. Ancestors, should we go to war? In terms of the leaders consulting and using divination, that's not, that paganism, it wasn't located only in Africa. You see that in a lot of places, right? Including Europe. Remember Boudica? Before Boudica decided to go to war against the Romans, she consulted, they did divinations. Remember the rabbit, and it said, go to war. And so that's not something that's just an African thing. But Africans did consult ritual priests who were very, very influential in what decisions they would make. Again, if you watch the Njinga version of the Netflix docudrama, you see them, right? Should we attack our enemies? What is going on? They really, really leaned in heavily on these priests who would help to guide them. So this is a little bit of the Ndongo. The soldiers would use spears, poison arrows, battle axes. That's how they would fight. You see that in, if you watch like Black Panther, for instance, right? There isn't the The Portuguese would eventually come with like guns and stuff. Again, gunpowder, all of that guns, that came originally from China, if you remember. That would be introduced later. But at that time, the local people, the soldiers, the military in Ndongo Kingdom, they used arrows, spears, and poisonous arrows and battle axes. Okay, and you see her training as well too. And so from early childhood, they practiced a rhythmic dance, which helped them with their speed and their agility. It allowed them to dodge the poison arrows of their enemies. Huge military force at the time. Okay, slave holding and slave trading was a vital part of the economy of Ndongo. And so the enslaved people would come from successful military excursions. So during a battle, if they defeated the other side, they then would become their enslaved people. They also came from the ranks of free villagers who were condemned by judges for religious infractions or civil disobedience, such as treason, adultery, especially if the adultery included any of the Angola's numerous wives. So if you thought you were a bad man and you decided to go and have an affair with the king's wives or concubines, that was punishable by enslaving you. And so there was slavery going on. It was not chattel slavery, right? Chattel slavery is what we get into when we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, which was really, really brutal. So sometimes we confuse the two. There are different forms of slavery. This was not chattel slavery. This form of slavery was different than another form of slavery. It wasn't slavery. They called it kijikos. Is that how you say it? Kijikos. Okay, so in the markets, there were two forms. The kijikos they were not slaves. They would be the equivalent of serfs. In Europe, they were called serfs. In Ndongo, they were called kijikos, okay? So Ndongo law regarded the kijikos as serfs. They were individuals who were tied to the land, but they were not slaves, okay? So those were the two forms of unpaid labor, sort of to speak, that was going on. So slavery was happening before the Europeans came. They just kicked it up a notch, and it was just a horrid in terms of the conditions, and again, chattel slavery. So close members of the Ngola, the king's household, as well as his children, those who had unusual births, or those who survived devastating illnesses, it was said that they possessed spiritual gifts, which, as we'll get into in Njinga's story, that was her. Okay, she came out breached, her umbilical cord was stuck around her throat, and all of that. Even her name means like twisted one or something. We're gonna get into it, but so she was said to have spiritual gifts. And not only that because of her birth, but because she was born into a royal family, it said that like she had double the spiritual gifts. Okay, so this is kind of life in the Ndongo Kingdom. So before she was born, 4 of the rulers who ruled it were men. So we're going to get into her story a little bit. I'm going to get into her story. But women, basically, it was more of an egalitarian society at that time. Of course, you still had, would it be patriarchy proper? Because you still have a hierarchy. You still have the king and a lot of the noblemen. Primarily, it was men that were ruling things. It was not necessarily women. She would be a little bit different, and you see that her story is a little bit unique. But even at that time, it was not common for like women to be ruling per se. Okay, women were important players in Ndongo's founding traditions. They figured prominently in the written accounts of Europeans who wrote about them. The wives especially had important roles to play. This is a little bit about the Ndongo Kingdom. The Portuguese would come well, the Portuguese have already come, right? In the 1483. It's important to know that the princesses, including Njinga, for instance, she had concubines herself. And so when they say like, oh, women don't have multiple men, that's not true. She had multiple lovers. She had multiple concubines as well too. And so when she became a ruler, she kind of took on, and a lot of women did that. You see, again, that's not just Africa. Remember, we've talked about Kahina in North Africa, Razia in India. Who else? Joan of Arc in Asia. Joan of Arc in Europe. The sisters in Vietnam, right? And so you see that again in different places, including Africa, women did elevate to these positions, and a lot of them did move similar to men. In Njinga, a lot of these women dressed like men. She chose not to dress like men. If anything, when the Europeans came, she was very adamant about dressing in her traditional African regalia, just to prove a point that, I love my people, I love my culture. She was she valued a lot of the old ways. She did eventually convert to Catholicism, but that was more of a political move, right? She didn't want to, but she recognized that if the Portuguese were to take her seriously, she would have to convert to Catholicism, especially to get the Pope's approval of her, right? And so converting wasn't always forced. Sometimes it was a political move. And for her, it was a political move for sure. Just one more thing I wanted to add about the role of women. Again, the role of women was really important, especially those that were like noble women, for instance. They usually got because they were in the inner circle, they got word of what the different military strikes were. And so a lot of them actually got a lot of insider information. Some of the women as well too were very influential in getting the men to make certain political moves. And again, that's all over the world. You see that. I don't remember who in Europe it was, but a couple of the women in Europe, remember from the 50 goddesses, no, not the 25 warriors, queens, and intellectuals, you see that in Europe as well too, right? Women are the ones that are kind of being like, don't make that move, make this move. Same as in Europe and Asia. And so women did have a prominent role to play, and everybody kind of had their roles within society. A woman who left her husband, it says, was not ostracized or even reprimanded, but was instead welcomed back to her family's lineage. So divorce didn't have this huge stigma. Okay, so this is a little bit about the Ndongo Kingdom. I'll be back to share more on what the Ndongo Kingdom looked like during and after the Portuguese invasions.